Okay, wow. Um, the listener sent over some research about human experimentation in World War II, and I gotta say, it's just absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
We're talking about Japan, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy,
Hmm.
all engaging in these like really systematic programs of just cruelty.
Hmm.
I mean, it's hard to even wrap my head around the scale and the just inhumanity of it all.
It's a really, really dark chapter in human history. And you know what makes it even more disturbing is that these weren't just like isolated incidents.
Wow.
We're talking about government sanctioned operations,
Wow.
dedicated resources personnel, all devoted to these horrific acts.
Absolutely. And it's not just the fact that it happened, it's the specific details. Like, for example, Unit 731 in Japan. I was reading about these vivisections they performed on prisoners. Can you even explain what that entailed?
So vivisection, it involved operating on live subjects and often without any
Oh
anesthesia.
my God.
It was just this brutal practice used to study organ function or disease progression. Just try to imagine the unimaginable pain these prisoners endured,
Wow.
strapped down, fully conscious as they were subjected to these horrific procedures.
It's just beyond comprehension. And it wasn't just vivisections. I mean, they infected people with diseases like the plague and cholera. They even deliberately inflicted frostbite, all in the name of science.
Mhm.
It just makes you wonder what kind of mindset allowed these atrocities to even take place.
Well, Japanese military culture at the time played a really significant role.
I see.
They were fueled by these expansionist ambitions, a sense of wartime urgency, and they had developed this dangerous belief in their own superiority. This, coupled with a culture of impunity within the military ranks, it created an environment where these horrific acts could be carried out with very little fear of consequence.
And what's even more disturbing is that the leader of Unit 731, Shiro Ishii, essentially walked away free.
Yeah, that's right. The U.S. government granted immunity to Ishii and many of his researchers. In exchange for their data, they saw the potential value of this information, especially in the context of the burgeoning Cold War and the race to develop biological weapons. However, this decision raises, really significant ethical questions about whether achieving strategic advantage justifies granting impunity to those who committed such heinous
Yeah,
acts.
it's a truly complex moral dilemma, and it makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of such a decision. But this dark undercurrent of twisted science, it wasn't limited to Japan. The Nazi experiments, especially those conducted by Joseph Mengele, are equally chilling. What drove him to perform such grotesque acts, particularly on twins?
So Mengele, he was obsessed with unlocking the secrets of heredity,
Yeah.
driven by the Nazi ideology of racial purity, their desire to create a master race. He saw twins, especially those with unique characteristics, as a key to understanding genetics. His experiments, however, were far from scientific. Injecting dyes into children's eyes, sewing twins together to create conjoined twins. These were acts of pure cruelty driven by a truly twisted worldview.
It's hard to believe that a medical doctor could be capable of such barbarity. But this warped sense of medical progress was also evident in the hypothermia experiments conducted at Dachau.
Yeah, and ironically, those experiments, they were aimed at finding ways to help German pilots who might be downed in cold waters.
Oh, wow.
They would submerge prisoners in ice water for hours, causing unimaginable suffering, and then experiment with different rewarming methods. But their methods were so inhumane and the data they collected was so unreliable that the experiments ultimately yielded very little practical value.
Mm.
It's a stark reminder of how, even with a seemingly noble goal, the pursuit of knowledge can be twisted into something truly monstrous.
And there's this recurring theme of using wartime as justification for these atrocities, as if the need to win a war somehow makes these actions acceptable. The high-altitude experiments, the mustard gas testing, all linked to specific military objectives, but carried out with utter disregard for human life.
Absolutely. The Nazis' wartime aims, they were often used as a shield to deflect criticism and justify their actions.
Right.
But the reality is that these experiments inflicted needless suffering on countless victims, many of whom died anonymously, their stories lost to history.
It's just heart-wrenching, and it makes you wonder if this desire to exploit wartime vulnerability for the sake of scientific progress was also present in other countries involved in the conflict.
Oh, it certainly was. In Fascist Italy, for instance, their brutal campaign in Ethiopia, it saw widespread use of chemical weapons and horrific experiments on prisoners of war.
It seems like Italy's role in these kinds of atrocities often gets overlooked.
Yeah, that's true. And it's partly due to the fact that they were less systematic and organized compared to the Japanese or the Nazi programs. But the brutality was undeniable. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, a key figure in the Italian military, he was notorious for his ruthlessness.
Yeah, his tactics in Ethiopia were absolutely barbaric. I read about mass killings, concentration camps, and a systematic campaign of torture. It's chilling to think that Italy largely escaped any major war crimes trials after the war, allowing figures like Graziani to evade true accountability.
Yeah, the lack of accountability for those responsible for these crimes in Italy is a really troubling aspect of this history.
Hmm.
It raises these complex questions about, the geopolitics of the time, the availability of evidence, and perhaps, a collective reluctance to confront these uncomfortable truths.
It's almost as if some wanted to sweep these atrocities under the rug, hoping they'd simply be forgotten.
Hmm.
But we can't let that happen. These stories need to be told, and those responsible need to be acknowledged, even if justice is no longer attainable.
Absolutely. Acknowledging these atrocities is crucial, not just for historical accuracy, but also for the sake of the victims and their families. Their suffering should not be forgotten or minimized.
Absolutely. And speaking of remembering amidst all this horror, there is at least a small glimmer of hope. The Nuremberg Code, which emerged as a direct response to the Nazi experiments, seems like a crucial turning point in how we approach ethical considerations in scientific research.
Yeah, the Nuremberg Code was indeed a watershed moment. It established 10 key principles for ethical human experimentation, emphasizing things like informed consent, the avoidance of unnecessary suffering, and the right of participants to withdraw from a study. It essentially placed the well-being of the individual above the interests of scientific advancement or national agendas.
Which seems like common sense now, right?
Right.
But back then, this was a revolutionary concept.
It was. Prior to the Nuremberg Code, there were no internationally recognized guidelines for ethical research involving human subjects.
Mhm.
So, as horrific as they were, those Nazi experiments, along with the other atrocities we've discussed, they forced the world to confront the ethical implications of scientific research and ultimately led to the development of guidelines intended to prevent such abuses from happening again.
So the Nuremberg Code was a step in the right direction.
Mm.
But are we to believe that everything is hunky-dory now? That the era of unethical human experimentation is behind us?
Unfortunately, it's not that simple. While the Nuremberg Code provided a framework for ethical research, it doesn't guarantee that these principles will always be upheld.
Right.
Human history is rife with examples of those in power exploiting their positions, and the pursuit of knowledge can sometimes blind people to ethical considerations, especially when secrecy or national security is involved.
It's a sobering thought. I mean, we've already talked about the Tuskegee syphilis study where black men were deliberately denied treatment for decades so researchers could observe the natural progression of the disease. It happened right here in the United States long after the Nuremberg Code was established.
The Tuskegee study is a stark reminder that even in countries with established ethical guidelines, vulnerable populations can still be exploited and abuses can occur.
Right.
It highlights the importance of continued vigilance, transparency, and a willingness to hold those who violate ethical principles accountable, regardless of their position or authority.
We can't just assume that because rules are in place, everyone will follow them. It takes constant effort and awareness to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself.
Precisely. And it's not just about big headline-grabbing cases like Tuskegee.
Right.
There's also the potential for more subtle forms of exploitation, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, where trials are sometimes conducted in developing countries with less stringent regulations and oversight.
The potential for exploitation in those situations is just enormous. I mean, if people are desperate for medical care or financial compensation, they might be more likely to participate in a study without fully understanding the risks involved or feeling pressured to remain in a trial even if they experience adverse effects.
That's a valid concern, and it underscores the need for strong international standards for ethical research, as well as the importance of empowering local communities and individuals to make informed decisions about their participation in any research project.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the big picture, the institutions and governments involved. But we can't lose sight of the individual human stories at the heart of these issues. We've talked about the perpetrators, but what about the victims? Their suffering should not be a mere footnote in history.
You're absolutely right. We can't allow ourselves to become numb to the human cost of these atrocities. Each statistic, each horrifying detail we've discussed represents a person who endured unimaginable pain, trauma, and dehumanization.
It's essential to remember that behind the data, behind the cold clinical descriptions of these experiments are real people with families, dreams, and lives that were forever altered by these horrific experiences.
You're absolutely right. We can't allow ourselves to become numb to the human cost of these atrocities. Each statistic, each horrifying detail we've discussed represents a person who endured unimaginable pain, trauma, and dehumanization.
It's essential to remember that behind the data, behind the cold clinical descriptions of these experiments, are real people with families, dreams, and lives that were forever altered by these horrific experiences. What can we do to ensure that their suffering is remembered and that their stories are heard?
I think it starts with acknowledging their experiences, giving them a voice, and recognizing their humanity. We need to document these atrocities meticulously, preserve the memories of those who perished, and educate future generations about what transpired.
It's about honoring their memory and making sure that their suffering wasn't in vain. Maybe by keeping these stories alive, we can prevent history from repeating itself.
Exactly. The victims of these experiments deserve our remembrance, our respect, and our unwavering commitment to upholding human dignity and ethical research practices.
Absolutely. Their stories are a powerful reminder of what can happen when we allow unchecked ambition and a thirst for knowledge to override our basic moral compass. It's a cautionary tale that we need to carry with us, not just as a reminder of the past, but as a guide for the future.
You bring up an important point. While we've focused on the horrors of World War II, it's crucial to recognize that human experimentation has a long and disturbing history extending far beyond that particular conflict.
Yeah, you're right. This isn't just ancient history. It's a pattern of behavior that has repeated itself throughout human history. It makes you wonder, where do we draw the line? How do we ensure that research is conducted ethically and that the mistakes of the past are not repeated?
Well, the Nuremberg Code, while imperfect, it was a significant step in the right direction. It established those fundamental principles of informed consent, avoiding unnecessary suffering, and allowing participants to withdraw from studies. Those principles are still relevant and serve as a foundation for ethical research practices today.
So informed consent is key. And we also need to ensure that vulnerable populations are not exploited. No more coercion, no more preying on those who might be desperate for medical care or financial compensation.
Exactly. Protecting vulnerable populations is paramount. And beyond those basic principles, transparency is crucial. Research protocols should be reviewed by independent ethics committees, and the results of studies should be made public.
That makes sense. Transparency promotes accountability. If researchers know their work will be scrutinized by their peers and the public, they're more likely to adhere to ethical guidelines.
It's also important to create a culture where whistleblowers feel safe coming forward. Often it's those who are closest to the research, those who witness ethical violations firsthand, who are in the best position to stop them.
So we need to encourage people to speak out when they see something wrong happening. We need to protect those who are willing to risk their careers to expose unethical practices.
Precisely. And ultimately, it comes down to a shift in mindset. We need to move away from the idea that scientific progress justifies any means and embrace a more humane approach, one that values the well-being and dignity of every individual.
This has been a truly eye-opening conversation, and I have to admit, it's left me with a lot to ponder. It's both horrifying and inspiring to see how humanity can simultaneously be capable of such darkness and such incredible progress.
It certainly is a complex and multifaceted issue. But the more we learn about the history of human experimentation, the better equipped we are to prevent such abuses from happening in the future.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the atrocities of World War II to the ongoing challenges of ensuring ethical research practices. But before we wrap up, I'd like to shift our focus to the broader context of human experimentation throughout history. Because as we've alluded to, these issues didn't simply emerge during wartime. They've been woven into the fabric of scientific exploration for centuries.
You're absolutely right. The desire to understand the human body and mind, to push the boundaries of knowledge, is a constant throughout history. And unfortunately, that desire has often led to ethical lines being crossed, sometimes with devastating consequences.
So let's explore that historical context. Give us a brief overview of some of the most notorious examples of human experimentation beyond what we've already discussed.
Well, we could go all the way back to ancient Egypt, where there's evidence of surgical experimentation on prisoners and slaves. But for the sake of time, let's fast forward a bit. In the 18th and 19th centuries, you had doctors experimenting with new surgical techniques, often on poor and marginalized populations who had little choice but to participate.
Like those grave robbers who would sell bodies to medical schools. That's pretty grim.
Exactly. And then you have the era of colonialism, where European powers conducted experiments on colonized populations in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, often under the guise of improving their health. But in reality, these experiments were exploitative and dangerous.
And, of course, there's the Tuskegee syphilis study, which we've already mentioned, a shameful chapter in American history that highlights how even in a country with established ethical guidelines, vulnerable populations can still be exploited.
Absolutely. Prisoners, people with mental illnesses, racial minorities, they've all been disproportionately targeted for research that often carried significant risks. It's a sobering reminder that vigilance is always necessary.
So given this long and often disturbing history, where do we go from here? How do we ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten and that research is conducted ethically in the future?
I think it's a multifaceted challenge. We need to continue to refine and strengthen ethical guidelines like the Nuremberg Code and ensure they are effectively implemented and enforced globally.
Right, and we need to be aware of the potential for exploitation, especially in contexts where power imbalances exist.
Absolutely. We also need to foster a culture of transparency and accountability in research. Independent review boards, open access to research data, and mechanisms for whistleblowers to safely report concerns are all essential components of a robust ethical framework.
It sounds like education is key as well. We need to teach future generations about the history of human experimentation, both the triumphs and the tragedies, so they can learn from the mistakes of the past and make informed decisions about the future of scientific research.
You're exactly right. Education is paramount. We need to equip future scientists, doctors, and policymakers with the knowledge and critical thinking skills necessary to navigate the complex ethical landscape of research involving human subjects.
Well, this has been a truly thought-provoking conversation. It's clear that the issues surrounding human experimentation are complex and multifaceted, with no easy answers.
That's true. But the more we understand the history, the ethical considerations, and the ongoing challenges, the better equipped we are to ensure that research is conducted responsibly and that the well-being and dignity of every individual are protected.
We've journeyed through some dark chapters in this deep dive, but hopefully we've also shed light on the importance of vigilance, ethical awareness, and a commitment to ensuring that scientific progress serves humanity, not the other way around.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, as we move forward, it's up to all of us to be informed, engaged, and critical thinkers. When we hear about new research, new discoveries, we need to ask questions. Who conducted the research? Who funded it? Were ethical guidelines followed?
Right. Don't just blindly accept information. Dig a little deeper. Do your own research and form your own conclusions.
Exactly, because the more we know, the more we question, the better equipped we are to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. The legacy of these World War II experiments and all the other unethical research that's been conducted throughout history should serve as a constant reminder that we must never take ethical research for granted.
That's a powerful takeaway. So to our listeners, we encourage you to stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going. And if you're interested in delving deeper into this topic, we've got a whole list of resources linked in the show notes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex and often unsettling world of human experimentation. Until next time, stay thoughtful and stay engaged.